Okay, let's talk about 5.6 pest control methods. Okay, all right. So, in order to control pests with our crops, farmers need to use pesticides, and these are chemicals that are toxic to pests. There are different types of pesticides. You can see those listed here. And if you look at the different types, you'll notice a pattern. If it's a rodenticide, it kills rodents. A fungicide kills fungi. They're not very creative with the names. They pretty much go along with what they're killing. Herbicides might be the most creative in that they kill plants. And one issue that we have with pesticides is that they can cause pests to become resistant to the pesticide with overuse of the pesticide. That's because genetic biodiversity gives some pests resistant traits to pesticides. And essentially, then what happens is that the pesticide will artificially select for pests that are resistant by they essentially kill off all of the non-resistant individuals, leaving only the resistant ones. And so we create something in this process that's called a pesticide treadmill. And let me kind of show you how this happens. So if you'll refer to this picture, you'll see that here we have a crop that's infested with some sort of a pest, some sort of a beetle that's eating the plant. And so the farmer will come through and they'll apply a pesticide. Most of the pests, when this pesticide is dispersed, most of those pests will die. But some individuals, let's say that there's individuals that have a thicker exoskeleton or a thicker shell, they'll actually be resistant because the pesticide won't be able to kill them off. And so those individuals are going to survive and they're going to be the ones that reproduce. They have babies and they pass along that thicker shell to their offspring. And so what this does is it ends up creating a new pest population that all have that resistance to the pesticide that the farmer's using. So the pesticide will can this happens over time, over several generations. And so every time that the farmer applies that pesticide, they're going to have less and less effective results until eventually that pesticide just no longer works on their crops. And then we need the pesticide company to create a different pesticide to battle this pest that has the harder, stronger shells. And so um, this pesticide treadmill can be a real problem for the pesticide industry. And so one way that they've combated this is they've started creating bt crops. Bt crops are crops that have bacteria, a gene from bacteria that's inserted into their genetic makeup, that now they create this bacterial strain that kills off the pest. And so they no longer actually need pesticides. So we're genetically modifying crops so that they will actually be more resistant to the pests. And so um or not more resistant, I'm sorry, they'll be more, well, yeah, they'll be more resistant to the pest. Yes, that's exactly right. So the gene for pest resistant trait is added to that plant like we talked about through genetic modification. bt corn was the very first gmo that was created this way, and basically the bacterial gene that produces a toxic crystal on the corn is inserted into the corn's genetic makeup, and now the pests will, get on the corn, they'll eat that crystal, that toxic crystal, and it kills them. So that's one way that we can get around get around that whole pesticide treadmill issue. Another type of genetically modified crop that's very common now is Roundup Ready crops that are resistant to herbicides, meaning that we can now spray for weeds. And before, when the corn would also die, or the crop would also die when we sprayed for weeds, now we can put this Roundup Ready crop in the field. We can spray the Roundup herbicide to get rid of all the weeds, and it kills all the weeds, but it doesn't actually kill the crop. And so this is just another example of how we might use genetic modification or create a GMO that's beneficial for the farming or agricultural industry. Okay. So here's just a picture showing that BT crystal gene that's inserted. And so you could stop the video and kind of look at that a little bit more. BT corn has actually decreased our insecticide use because the corn now makes its own insecticide, and you can see the chart there that shows that. And then the Roundup Ready crops have actually increased our use of herbicides since the crops can't be harmed by it. So you can see that in one way, we're reducing the amount of chemicals that are used, but in another way, we're actually increasing the amount of chemical use. And so there's pros and cons to both GMOs and pesticide use. The point for the farmer is we want to get a higher yield. And so using these various genetically modified organisms allows the farmer to get a higher yield. Higher yield means more crops, means more money for the farmers. So, GMOs and genetic diversity. Why are GM crops potentially an issue for genetic diversity? Well, essentially, GM crops are all genetically identical. They're all clones. I mean, the seed manufacturers, that is a lucrative field. If anyone's interested in genetics, that going into seed genetic modification is a huge money making field. But they're basically all clones, and so they're all genetically identical, and there's no genetic diversity within that population. So if a disease comes through that wipes out or impacts the GM crop, then all of those crops are going to be vulnerable to that disturbance, and there will be no chance of a genetic mutation occurring that's going to provide that crop with an adaptive trait. One area where this has happened is with potatoes. And so we have the original crop. In the past, we had this original crop of potatoes that's very diverse with lots of different varieties. With, let's say that something like a blight, which is a common fungus that occurs within potatoes that comes into the field, the blight's going to kill these potatoes varieties that are now black over here, and we're left with just these varieties of potato after the disease happens. So we still have potato after the disease happens. That's good for farmers. But now we have clone potatoes. So let's say that there's some sort of fungus that comes through and it kills all of these cloned potatoes. It's going to kill every single potato. And now the farmers lost their entire field of crops. So that's why that's one way that genetically modified crops can actually be a problem. So, practice FRQ 5.6, describe one economic advantage and one economic disadvantage of using GM crops. And next time, we're going to be talking about 5.7, meat production methods, and I'll see you guys in class.